Hello, welcome to the presentation on Australia and New Zealand by Sarah Castellanos, Xavier Bueno, and Emmeline Crone. The whereabouts. It is located at 9 degrees south and 48 degrees south and 114 degrees east to 178 degrees east. And then here is an image showing the location. And one thing to note about this region that is very far away from the old world. Now here's a modern map showing some major airports in the area. And you're going to see the distance in between all the airports in accordance to Australia and New Zealand. And another thing to note about the region is the isolation. It's very isolated to the right with the largest ocean in the world, the Pacific Ocean, and to the left, the Indian Ocean. And this makes Australia very hard to get to and very hard to navigate to get to Australia, especially throughout history. There are very little invasions in this region due to just the water alone. And even though Australia is isolated, it's still closely related to Britain and France, since Britain and France both had colonies in the region throughout history. Now, unfortunately, Australia is not a major economic region in the world, but it has very strong potential since it has a large area with a lot of natural resources that is able to import to other larger countries. And then, of course, the water surrounding the region offers protection, which I'll go into more detail later. So here's a larger map of the entire world of all 7 continents. And here you can see Australia, just how distant it is from Europe and Asia. And this made it very hard for the old world to try and invade Australia due to just hard to navigate waters, and of course the Southern Pacific, which is very hard to navigate throughout the islands. So Australia is just very protected by the ocean. Nations and capitals. So the capital for Australia is Canberra, which is located in the southwestern main continental portion of Australia. Then here is Australia's flag. And then Wellington of New Zealand, which is located in the southern tip of the North Island of New Zealand. Then here is New Zealand's flag. Now, one thing to note is the Union Jack and the blue ensign of England. And the reason that they both have this is to symbolize the close relation and, throughout history, the colonization of this region. But these countries do have their own identities with their flags, by Australia having 6 white stars and New Zealand having 4 red stars. Landscape regions. Here are all the major landscape regions, and I'll go into more detail about them later. So in Australia, we have the Great Dividing Range, the Great Artesian Basin, the Murray-Darling Basin, the Western Plateau, and the Great Barrier Reef. And in New Zealand, we have the North Island, South Island, Rotorua, Canterbury Plain, Southern Alps, Mount Cook, and Milford Sound. So let's first talk about the Great Dividing Range. So the Great Dividing Range is located on the eastern part of Australia, and most Australians actually live on the west of the Great Dividing Range. There's many plains. And the Great Dividing Range is about 2,237 miles long. And you can tell that no one lives here just by the vast mountains and scenery, so it makes it very hard to live in the area. The Great Artesian Basin. Now, the Great Artesian Basin is actually the largest and deepest artesian basin in the world. And it measures about 660,000 square miles. And this provides the only source of fresh water in Australia. And then next, we have the Great Barrier Reef, which is the world's largest coral reef system with vast amounts of coral reef and marine life. Now, unfortunately, due to global warming, there's been a massive decrease in the life of the coral and marine life. As you can see by this image here, is some coral dying, and the fact that the coral is dying It's leaving a lot of marine life without a habitat, and they're leaving, and then a lot of species are going extinct. And Australia is actually putting $379 million into trying to repair the coral reef system. Next, we have the Western Plateau, which is on the western part of Australia, and it covers 2/3 of Australia. And there's very little rainfall in this area. And due to its dry nature and its hilly nature, it makes it very uninhabitable to live. That's why you can see on the map here, the plains surrounding it, most people live in that area instead of the Western Plateau itself. Next, we have Rotorua, which is located in the northwestern tip of the North Island of New Zealand. Now, Rotorua is actually a tourist city, a tourist attraction that actually has a lot of geysers and hot springs, which attracts a lot of tourists, and how New Zealand gets a lot of its income from. It has very beautiful hot springs here, since New Zealand is very highly active geological area with lots of volcanoes and a lot of earthquakes happening every year. The Southern Alps. The Southern Alps is in the central area of the South Island in New Zealand. And with its highest peak at around 12,218 feet. And it has 16 other points that exceed 9,800 feet. So it's a very significant mountainous area in this region. The resource bases. Now, Australia really has 4 major resource bases. It has coal, which is located in the Great Dividing Range, iron ore, which is in northwestern Australia, uranium, which is south and southwest Australia, and crude oil, the northwestern and southwestern shores of Australia. Now you can see by this map here, very large amounts of coal in the Great Dividing Range, and lots of iron in the Western Plateau. And this is where most of the natural resources come from. You can see just the vast potential that this region has in the area for economic growth, as well as New Zealand having a lot of hydropower and a lot of coal as well. A lot of green energy and a lot of economic power or potential economic power in the region.
Moving on to the population of Australia and New Zealand. The current population of Australia is about 25 million. Australia's population is equivalent to 0.33% of the total world population. The population density in Australia is 3 per square kilometers. For New Zealand's population is estimated at around 4 million people at mid-year, according to the UN data. New Zealand's population is equivalent to 0.06% of the total world population. The population density in New Zealand is around 47 people per square mile. The total land area is around 100,000 square miles, and 86.9% of the population is urban. And here are some maps for Australia. On the right is a map for the population density, and to the left is the population from 2010 to 2020. The top populated nations for Australia, number 1 is Sydney, New South Wales, with a percentage of 20.93% of the population. Melbourne, Victoria region at 19.86% of the population. Brisbane, Queensland at 9.85% of the population. Perth, Western Australia at 8.24% of the population. Adelaide, South Australia at 5.38% of the population. Gold Coast, New South Wales at 2.72% of the population. Canberra, Australian capital at 1.83% of the population. Number 8, Sunshine Coast, Queensland at 1.33 population. And the list goes on, but these are the top ones. Continuing with New Zealand. Number 1, Auckland at around 1,500,000 people. Wellington at around 400,000 people. Christchurch, Canterbury at 400,000 people. Hamilton at around 240,000 people. Tauranga Bay of Plenty at around 140,000 people, and the list goes on, as you can see. And to the left is the map of New Zealand at which shows the people per square kilometers, and to the right is a chart of the ethnic composition. For civilizations, the Aboriginals are Australia's indigenous people. Recent government statistics counted approximately 400,000 Aboriginal people, or about 2% of Australia's total population. Australian Aborigines migrated from somewhere in Asia at least 30,000 years ago. They don't know where exactly they migrated from, but they know it's from Asia. Continuing with the Maori civilization, the Maori are the indigenous Polynesian people of New Zealand. The Maori originated with settlers from eastern Polynesia who arrived in New Zealand in several waves of walk-up voyages roughly between 1320 and 1350. Today, the Maori, along with the Aboriginal, remain as one of the oldest civilizations in New Zealand. And for the picture, you can see this is one of the pictures of the Maori. And for this picture, these are the Aboriginal civilization. For the languages, Australia's main language is Australian English. There is other indigenous languages such as Tasmanian languages, Australian Aboriginal languages, Torres Strait languages. And for minority languages, there is the Mandarin Chinese, Italian, Arabic, Greek, Cantonese, and other sign languages that Aboriginals speak. For New Zealand, the top language is New Zealand English, which the majority of the people speak. The Maori, Samoan, Hindi, Mandarin Chinese, French, and Cantonese. For the cultures, Australia doesn't really have a culture because they're really diverse. So they don't really have a uniform national culture because the country is made up of so many different cultures. That was due to waves of migration following European colonization in the late century, and that should be a C. New Zealand in total has 213 ethnic groups that were identified by the census. There are 196 countries recognized by statistics in New Zealand. The 5 largest ethnic groups in New Zealand are New Zealand European, Maori, Chinese, Samoan, and Indian, and ethnic diversity has been increasing. For music and dances are important for New Zealand and Australia. They are important for ceremonies that take part in the indigenous cultures that remain. For example, the Aboriginals and Maori. In the picture in the back, you can see the children copying their parents for a specific dance. For this picture, you can see it is an Aboriginal ceremony known to most people as corroborees. These are dramatic representations in mime and song of the mythical histories of the tribe. These ceremonies have many functions and take many forms. These ceremonies are also sacred, and there is non-sacred ceremonies. During sacred ceremonies, people from outside of the community are not allowed to attend. Non-sacred ceremonies are usually performed at night in front of the men, women, and children of the tribe. A group of adult men seated around a small fire chant one of their ancient songs. Others, through dance and songs, act out different elements of the myth they are telling. For New Zealand dances, the traditional war dance, the haka, has been immortalized by New Zealand's All Blacks rugby team. These ritualistically perform the act before each match. The pre-battle cry is performed to incite fear and proclaim strength of the Maori by hard stomping, body flapping, and poking at the tongue with a wild gaze. Traditional welcome ceremonies, pohiri, bring visitors to the meeting grounds in the heart of the Maori community. A warrior will challenge guests to see if they come in peace, followed by a representation of waida, quotation songs, and speeches. The haka is a traditional war dance. The haka, the Maori have been using for a really long time. And right here is another portrayal of the haka. For political structures, Australia has a federal system of governments. Political power is distributed between the federal government and the 6 states. There is also the Commonwealth Parliament, which has the Queen, Governor General, and the 2 houses, House of Representatives and the state. For bills to be passed, it needs to go through both houses, Governor General, and Parliament. New Zealand has a House of Reps and a Prime Minister, which is appointed by the Governor General. The Prime Minister will appoint its cabinet. New Zealand is a constitutional monarchy and a parliamentary democracy. For organizations, one of the organizations they have is the Fair Trade Association. It is a member-based organization that supports both countries' different ways of trade and to agree to more fair ways of trade. Continuing with the Australian and New Zealand Association, which is based on creating a safe social space for Australians and New Zealand and organizing hobby and job-related groups. And lastly, the Global Business Trade Association, which is a voice of business management throughout both countries. Some of the issues that they have: housing and homelessness, difficult for people to get credit, difficult to find land, and lack of government intervention to support citizens, higher concern for global warming, health administration is underperforming and not funded enough to keep with demand, infrastructure design and reliability is not keeping up with growth in population, high profile corruption in New Zealand's government, the serious fraud the Serious Fraud Office filed criminal charges against 4 people in relation to an alleged fraud donation. 32% of residents say housing is hard to pay for, and 20% are homeless. Earthquakes also damage a lot of the infrastructure and cause millions of dollars in damages. And that is all for our presentation. Thanks for viewing.